What is mankind's greatest invention? This is a question that my father asked me when I was a kid, and one that his father asked him. And the answer wasn't medicine, it wasn't technology, it wasn't even the wheel. The answer is language. This is the overriding theme that I've held with me throughout my entire life. I was raised in a bilingual home to two Arab parents, my mother from Morocco and my father from Lebanon. Both were just as passionate about language as I am today and made sure to instill the same passion in me. Growing up bilingual meant I had to grapple with not only two dialects within the Arabic language, but Arabic and then English when I go to school. And this taught me language truly shapes identity. You see, language is the keystone of our human experience. It's how we communicate, how we debate, how we write constitutions and laws, how we conversate, how we defend our statements and our opinions, how we share ideas, and sometimes how we tweet out questionable tweets. Now, this has been an overriding theme of my life, and being an Arabic speaker has only intensified this passion for language. You see, the Arabic language is deeply poetic, and it's one that speaks to the power of language within its patterns. Let's look at an example. In the Arabic language, the word for letter comes from the root that means a sharp edge, and the word for word comes from the roots that means wound, and the word for story comes from the roots that means to cut. Now, there's a theme here, right? And it's something we've heard before, and that is that words hurt, they cut deep, right? And my name, Ayah, is the word used to label verses in the Holy Quran, and its root meaning is miracle. So not to be cheesy, but while words can hurt and cut deep, words can also be magical. It's our choice. Now that I've told you my name, which is Ayah, I can tell you all how excited I am to be here standing in front of you. Tonight's theme is about going from conversations to action, pursuing change, right? And what I'm going to propose in my talk is that perhaps going beyond words simply requires that we change the words we're using, or in the very least, be more conscious of them. Now, I'm going to tackle this from a variety of perspectives. As an Arab American Muslim woman, I'm going to talk about how language is monumental in either building an identity or utterly destroying it. As an aspiring journalist, I will discuss how media makers today and media creators actually have the chore, or rather the responsibility, to create truth through language. And as a poet, how language is of our greatest advantage in collaborating through human experience. When I was a kid, I would play this game with myself when I go to the library. I loved reading, but sometimes I would purposely check out books without words, picture books, and I would sit for hours on end trying to generate the greatest number of possible stories simply based on the illustrations. And in the third grade, I used up every recess session that we had to organize my classmates to put on a play that I wrote called The Friendly Monster, effectively erasing all possible stigmas against giant fluffy creatures in forests. What these experiences taught me as a child was something monumental that still sticks with me till today. And that is, the bad guy and the good guy can differ simply based on the words we use to describe them. As I've grown older, this isn't just a blast of the past. This is an idea that I still hold today. And as days go by, it grows more relevant. Let's backtrack to one particular day to make this more clear to you. 9/11. Now, in this room, raise your hand if you remember exactly where you were on the day the attacks happened, or what you were doing. Okay, wow, basically all of you. And same for me. But what I want to discuss is not the day the attacks happened, but what came after, the aftermath. You see, 9/11 was an act of hate that created a language of hate, one that continues to persist till today. This language translates into words like Arab, towelhead, terrorist, It translates into the phrase, "Go home Arabs," with a swastika sign carved into the hood of my family's 90s maroon Chevrolet station wagon. And coincidentally, every time, without fail, it translates into the phrase, "Ma'am, I think we're gonna have to do a random security check at the airport." You see, 9/11 wasn't the day that my story started, but it was the day that my story and the stories of many others were hijacked. Typically, stories begin way before birth. They begin through bloodlines, through geography, through mother tongue. But when we reduce people to sound bites, labels, one-word taglines, we strip them of all these things and make them more susceptible to being dehumanized. You see, we sustain stereotypes through the language that polarizes and simplifies entire groups of people. No longer are we individuals, we're just one big muddle of one word. Now, I'm gonna play a game with you guys. There are no rules except for that you need to be really honest with yourself, not with me. You don't need to write anything down. I'm just gonna go ahead and put on some words on the screens, and I want you to pay very close attention to what your visceral reaction to them is. Are you going to feel uncomfortable? What's the image that's conjured up in your head? I'm gonna go through them a little quickly, but just go ahead and think really deeply as you read them. All right. So, like I said, the only rule was to be honest. So, raise your hand if you were actually even slightly surprised by your responses to these words. Okay, a few of us, and including me. I've done this game before as well. You're not alone. You see, humans psychologically love to simplify things. We love to categorize things. It makes things easy, edible. Hermione from Harry Potter once said, "Fear of a name only increases fear of the thing itself." What just happened there was we saw a word or a phrase, and immediately we had a reaction we didn't expect. So how was language that powerful? You see, what's happening nowadays is that we've grown so afraid of certain words, certain phrases, certain labels and stereotypes that we've completely walled ourselves off from seeing those that lie behind them. And this isn't unique to only the Arab or Muslim American experience. This has persisted across centuries. If language is powerful, those who control it have the power to control those who they describe, right? The power of language is why Native Americans, as an example, weren't allowed to speak their native tongue when entered into boarding schools in the US. It's why slavery was justified, because it was fine to enslave a savage or property, right? It's why colonialists rename cities the moment they claim a piece of land. And it's why books are censored, because of the language that they withhold within them. And today, it's calling Mexicans drug dealers and rapists, and refugees potential murderous skittles, according to our president. From these examples, we see that creating social change doesn't just come from civil rights protests or marching in the streets, which those things are important, but we must recognize that social change also begins by resisting and reclaiming a deeply ingrained lexicon that criminalizes and vilifies us. Now, this brings me to journalism. In the 4th grade, I finally put together and put into words my experiences after 9/11, things I spoke to you about earlier. I put them in an essay, and I read that essay out loud to my class, and after school, my teacher asked to speak with me. She was really emotional. She told me she was so happy that I was being brave and telling my story, and she hugged me, and she gave me a notebook and a really cute matching pen, and she told me to be a journalist. she told me to tell my story. I ran home that day telling my mother I knew exactly what I wanted to be when I grew up. It all suddenly made sense. Now, granted, I had no idea what a journalist was at that time. All I knew was that telling stories and getting free pens and notebooks occasionally sounded kind of nice. But from then on, I concerned myself with discovering what this occupation really was. I would sit after school with my dad, watching the news every single day, with such concentration, in fact, that I would nod and smile at the newscaster, thinking that he or she actually could see me. Later, I discovered this was not true. So, my relationship with the news has changed over the years. As I've matured, so too has my perspective on global issues, on domestic issues. And if there's one thing that's taught me, it's that news is complicated. It's no longer just about bad guys and good guys like in my picture books. And that has taught me that journalists hold a monumental responsibility. They have a delicate endeavor to tackle. As Dr. Edward Chiappa once said, naming is never neutral. As we strive to be objective, we must always be aware that every single person, me, all of you here, hold our own internal biases. And we must be aware that what we choose to report, how we choose to report it, even how quick we choose to report it, will affect the mindsets of others. Essentially, media creators and journalists shape truth. Now, I'm not speaking to a room full of journalists, so I understand some of you might be like, okay, so what does this have to do with me? Well, whether we like it or not, all of us are consumers of news. We're constantly scrolling, liking, watching videos. They play automatically nowadays. You don't even have to want to watch it. So we're constantly digesting these headlines and these stories without even thinking twice. And it isn't our fault. They just kind of show up. But now that you've heard this from me, I challenge you all to be more critical consumers. That when you see something, you don't just swallow it right away. You taste test it. You chew it, check the ingredients, and if it's really fishy, then you spit it out. Like I mentioned, I am a poet. I mentioned this earlier. And I'm a spoken word poet, which means I perform poetry. It also means I'm a huge nerd. So if you see me typing vigorously away at my phone, I'm probably not texting someone. I'm probably actually just really inspired by the last TED Talk and writing something down. Spoken word poetry is performed poetry. And I've done it in countless venues. I've performed in churches, in mosques, in schools, conferences, dinners. I've taught workshops to young kids to teach them how they can express themselves. And I've done duets. But recently, I ended up in this weird funk. I deliberately decided I didn't want to write poetry anymore. I didn't want to perform. And the reason? I believed words were powerless. Words meant nothing. I became demoralized. Amidst all the injustice, not only abroad, but within our own backyards, I thought to myself, what difference is this going to make? After a lot of thought and several months, and the encouragement of several friends, I came to the realization that it actually wasn't poetry that was so important. It wasn't what made the performance so important. It wasn't about the rhymes or the alliterations or the metaphors. Rather, it was simply about speaking my truth and speaking the truth of many others whose voices otherwise couldn't hear us. Now, I'm not asking you all to go ahead and write a Shakespearean sonnet, because to be honest, I would never want to take up that offer either. I'm simply challenging you guys to find a means of expression, to state your truth, to use language, to grapple with it, and if not, to listen to others. You see, what's special about spoken word poetry, and I love spoken word poetry, so I'm going to talk about this all day. What's special about spoken word poetry is the fact that it's not about following rules and regulations set by professors in their offices. It's about breaking the rules of language. It's about writing a 25-line poem that actually includes 3 languages and is like 5 different sentences. Like, it doesn't make sense. It's so confusing and it's messy. But isn't that how we are as human beings? Our identities are ever evolving. Our backgrounds, our stories. See, what spoken word poetry does, and what other means of expression do, is they challenge others who want to strip us down to one soundbite, to one word, to one label. They're nuanced, they're rich, they're chaotic, like every single person in this room and every single person on this planet. Now, we all gathered here today for this TED conference, I guess, with hopes of hearing the personal stories of others and crossing our fingers that we leave knowing exactly what we need to do to change the world. I don't know if that's how you feel, but sometimes I feel that way. And this sounds kind of overwhelming, right? Easy enough? Actually, yeah, it's not so difficult. We all communicate with others. We all read. We all attend classes. And by read, I don't mean just read books. Read the world around you. Reading signs, reading stories. So what I'm challenging you to do is simply reassess the language you're reading. Reassess the words others are using. Reassess the labels that we are calling ourselves by, to know ourselves and thereby revolutionize the way we perceive the world. Now, this whole time we've been talking about how powerful language is, right? And we know from Batman something very monumental, and that is, with great power comes, yes, great responsibility. And so that means that we have a prime opportunity here. It shouldn't be overwhelming. It should be exciting. All of us could change the world simply by changing our words. Thank you guys so much.